This lecture, we're going to talk about Gothic architecture. One of the ways in which you can truly understand a culture is through art. And during the Middle Ages, architecture was one of the primary visual arts that was available that society invested in. Beginning in France during the 12th century and spread to the rest of Europe, this style of architecture evolved from Romanesque architecture. During the time period of Gothic architecture, it was usually called the French style. Gothic was a term that gets applied to it that was meant to be derogatory. The term Gothic or Goth has a lot of meanings that have evolved over time, but one of those meanings was that it was barbaric. And that's what they were trying to draw upon when they were calling it Gothic architecture. Gothic architecture, it's really most known for styles of cathedrals and churches that were built between the 1100s to the 1500s, but it can be found in other places such as castles, palaces, town halls, universities, and some private dwellings. All right, now I need you guys to look at the assignment here. I'm going to ask you guys to look at two images. Now, these are the outsides of two cathedrals. I'd like you to write what is different and what is similar between these two images here. So here is Cathedral 1. Now, obviously, feel free to pause this if you need to. One of those cathedrals was in Romanesque style. One of them is Gothic. So let's talk about what Romanesque style means. It was popular in Europe prior to the Gothic style. Sometimes this was called Norman architecture, and it began sometime after the fall of Rome, which is usually cited as 492, and continued until the beginning of the Gothic period, the 1100s. The style known was for symmetrical plans, these round arches, thick walls and pillars, and groin vaults. Groin vaulting. Now, this is different than Gothic architecture. The Gothic cathedral was meant to represent the entire universe. The loftiness and huge dimensions of the church was meant to represent the power of God. The mathematical and geometrical nature of the construction represented an orderly universe. So it is not based on the pure symmetry that we see in Romanesque style, but there is also some of that same patterning, some of that same emphasis here. This, of course, is the front of Notre Dame, which is a classic example of Gothic architecture. Now, most Gothic cathedrals were shaped like a cross. The towers reached impossibly high to try to get to heaven. Statues and stained glass windows depicted saints and scenes from the Bible. Again, most people couldn't read, and the Bible was only written in Latin at the time. So very few people could actually understand the Bible itself. Here you can see the shape of the Gothic cathedral with its cross-like pattern here. Now you're going to see pictures, but it doesn't really do justice for the amount of light that Gothic architecture brought in. Now, again, I'm going to ask you to do another one of these comparisons. This is again going to be a Romanesque church and a Gothic cathedral. Please compare the two images of the interiors. So I hope you can see the differences in those two styles. One of those is ribbed vaulting that can be used to create rectangular and irregular shapes in the roof. It allows for the pointed arches that is synonymous with the Gothic architecture style. it allows for much more weight to be supported without as much in terms of thicker walls, like a round arch. So here you can see the pattern of ribbed vaulting here. The image on the left shows a diagram of it, and on the right is a picture of the interior of Salisbury Cathedral, which is one of my favorite Gothic cathedrals here. Now, these arches are what allows for this tall structure, which again is suggesting this aspiration to heaven. And it actually became sort of these competitions between medieval towns about whose cathedral was actually taller. Flying buttresses
Have you guys heard a word I've said?
are another example of structures that help support the weight of the building. So the things that make Gothic architecture possible is that style of vaulting and the flying buttresses, because in Romanesque style, the thickness of the walls and the pillars is what had to support the weight, and that meant that it was a very limited heights that these buildings could be built to. With these external supports of the flying buttresses, towns began to build these tremendously tall structures, and again, it became sort of a point of pride over whose was bigger. Stained glass windows is another feature of Gothic architecture. Romanesque style, because again, the weight needed to be supported by the walls, had very small windows that let in very little amounts of light. With these Gothic cathedrals, there could be huge walls of windows that would allow in a tremendous amount of light. Oftentimes, they would depict images and scenes from the Bible, which for a largely illiterate audience became the way that many people actually learned about Christianity, because the sermons were also delivered in a language that they couldn't speak. That would be Latin.